There is a quiet space on social media where something is noticeably absent. Not an empty profile, but the absence of faces. No self-images offered for public viewing. When you notice this, a question forms almost automatically. It isn't really curiosity about a choice, it's curiosity about a state of mind. As you scroll, your brain is already trying to make sense of what isn't being shown. Human identity is deeply visual. Faces have always been shortcuts to trust, familiarity, and emotional prediction. When photos are missing, the mind doesn't register neutrality, it registers ambiguity. And ambiguity creates space. That space invites interpretation. You may sense that people who don't post their photos are doing something intentional, even if you can't quite explain what that intention is. That feeling comes from an unfilled mental template. Within that absence often lives a heightened awareness of being observed, not fear, but a steady sense of being seen from the outside. For some people, posting a photo feels like fixing a version of themselves in place. Once an image becomes public, it begins to age, to collect judgments, and to drift away from how the person actually experiences themselves. Avoiding photos becomes a way of keeping the self fluid, unfinished, privately owned. Photos also imply emotional timing. They usually capture moments that feel complete or celebratory, but some people rarely feel finished with themselves. Their inner life is ongoing, recursive, constantly revising. Posting a photo would suggest arrival, and arrival doesn't match their internal narrative, so the image never feels right, not because it looks wrong, but because it feels premature. You might notice that people who avoid posting their photos often express themselves easily in other ways, through words, ideas, humor, opinions, or images of places and objects. This isn't withdrawal from connection, it's selective presence, a preference for being understood through thought rather than appearance. For them, the face feels like the loudest and least precise language available. There is also the matter of memory. Photos don't just show others who you are, they show you who you were. For some, that reminder feels grounding. For others, it feels dissonant, like being confronted with an outdated version of yourself that people still use to define you. Not posting photos reduces fixed reference points, allowing change to remain fluid and untracked. Social platforms quietly encourage comparison, not always envy, but calibration. Where do I fit? How do I rank? People who opt out of posting photos are often highly sensitive to these hierarchies. They recognize how quickly self-perception can become tangled with external ranking. Avoiding photos becomes a way to prevent that entanglement from forming. There's often a private intensity behind this choice, an attentiveness to how images flatten complexity. A smile becomes a personality, a pose becomes a lifestyle. Once you notice how reductive that process is, participating in it can feel like self-erasure rather than self-expression. The absence becomes a quiet refusal. Privacy plays a role too, not secrecy, but containment. Some people feel their inner life loses meaning when it's too widely distributed. Sharing a photo can feel like turning something personal into something consumable. Keeping their image offline preserves a boundary that feels stabilizing. Interestingly, this pattern often appears alongside a strong internal sense of identity, not always confidence in appearance, but confidence in who they are. When you know yourself without needing reflection from others, visual validation becomes optional. The self doesn't disappear when it isn't mirrored back. At the same time, there can be vulnerability beneath the surface. Photos invite interpretation without context. They allow others to write stories you can't control. For people who think carefully about how they're perceived, being misseen can feel worse than being unseen. Over time, the absence of photos begins to function like negative space in a drawing. It shapes perception precisely because it's empty. Others may project mystery, depth, restraint, or distance onto it. The person themselves may barely think about it anymore. What began as a feeling becomes a habit, then simply a way of existing online. If you recognize this pattern in yourself, it probably doesn't feel like rebellion. It feels like alignment, a quiet sense that some parts of you make more sense when they aren't displayed. When appearance stops being the primary currency, the mind relaxes. In the end, the lack of photos isn't an absence of self, it's a different placement of it. The self still moves through thoughts, conversations, preferences, and silences. And when you notice that, the question of why someone doesn't post their photos softens into an understanding that presence doesn't always require visibility. If this resonated with you, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more calm, psychology-based insights.